In the dusty town of Millbrook, where hope withered like tumbleweeds and dreams died under the unforgiving sun, 23-year-old Rosalie stood on the auction block, the last unsold bride in a territory where women were scarcer than water. In August, the morning of September 15th, 1887, dawned with the kind of merciless heat that made even the rattlesnakes seek shade. Rosalie Whitmore smoothed her faded blue calico dress, the only decent thing she owned, and tried to ignore the way her stomach churned like butter in a storm. Around her, 12 other young women primped and preened, their nervous chatter filling the cramped back room of McDonald's General Store. "Remember, girls," called out Mrs. Abernathy, the thin-lipped matron who'd escorted them west on the bride train. "Stand tall, smile pretty, and don't mention any unfortunate circumstances from your past." Rosalie's fingers traced the small scar above her left eyebrow, a reminder of the fire that had claimed her family's farm in Missouri, along with her parents and younger brother. The same fire that had left her face slightly marked, her left hand bearing twisted pink scars from when she'd tried desperately to save little Thomas from the flames. She was beautiful still, Lord knew she was, with cornsilk hair that caught sunlight like spun gold and eyes the color of spring violets. But in a world where perfection was expected in a wife, even small flaws could doom a woman to spinsterhood. "Now, Rosalie," Mrs. Abernathy's voice cut through her thoughts, "you'll need to work extra hard today. The men here are looking for wives who can bear strong children and work the land. They don't want damaged goods." Damaged goods? The words stung worse than alkali dust in an open wound. Outside, the auction block, really just a wooden platform hastily erected in the town square, waited, like a stage for the most important performance of her life. Already, men had begun gathering. Cowboys with sun-weathered faces and shopkeepers in their Sunday best. Widowers with children clinging to their legs. Young bachelors whose eyes held the desperate hunger of men who'd spent too many nights alone. Under endless stars point one by one, the other women were called forward. Margaret, the banker's daughter from Boston, went first, her dowry of $200 and her finishing school education making her the prize catch. She was claimed within minutes by the town's wealthiest rancher. Then came pretty Susan with her musical laugh, sweet-tempered Lydia who could cook like an angel, and sturdy Ruth whose broad shoulders promised she could work alongside any man. Each time, the bidding was swift and decisive. Rosalie watched from the shadows as woman after woman found her future husband. The crowd grew smaller, more selective. The sun climbed higher, and still she waited. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Abernathy's voice held a note of desperation now. "You're the last." Walking onto that platform felt like approaching the gallows. The remaining men, perhaps 8 or 9, looked up at her with expressions ranging from mild interest to obvious disappointment. She saw their eyes linger on her scars, saw the way they whispered among themselves. "Now, gentlemen," called out Mayor Hutchins, acting as auctioneer, "we have Miss Rosalie Whitmore, age 23, from Missouri. She's a fine woman with good breeding and a Christian upbringing." The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. "She can read and write," the mayor continued, sweat beading on his forehead. "And she's experienced in household management." Someone in the crowd coughed. A tumbleweed rolled across the square, and Rosalie felt her cheeks burn with shame. Hotter than the September sun. "Do I hear any bids?" Mayor Hutchins' voice cracked slightly. "Nothing." You can almost taste the dust settling on her dreams as the seconds ticked by. The remaining men shuffled their feet, studied their boots, looked anywhere but at her. She was 23, practically an old maid by frontier standards, and marked besides. In a land where beauty and youth were the only currency a woman possessed, she might as well have been trying to trade fool's gold. Just as Mayor Hutchins opened his mouth to declare the auction closed, a voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "I'll take her." Every head turned toward the source of that deep, gravelly voice. There, standing apart from the other men, was someone Rosalie hadn't noticed before. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His hair was dark as midnight with threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered handsomeness of a man who'd lived hard and loved deeply. But it was his eyes that caught her breath, pale blue like winter's sky, beautiful and haunting and filled with a grief so profound it made her own sorrows seem small by comparison. Mr. Caleb Thornton, Mayor Hutchins sputtered, clearly as surprised as everyone else. Well, that is, do you wish to bid? The man, Caleb, stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly in the sudden silence. I'm not bidding, Mayor. I'm offering. His gaze found Rosalie's across the dusty square. Miss Whitmore, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The world seemed to tilt sideways. This man, this stranger with sorrow carved into the lines of his face, was asking her to marry him, not purchasing her like livestock, but asking. Around them, the crowd began to murmur. Someone whispered about his dead wife, about the tragedy that had claimed her and their unborn child just 6 months prior, about how he'd sworn never to love again. But Rosalie barely heard the whispers. She was lost in those winter sky eyes, seeing something there that matched the broken places in her own heart. But what she didn't know was that Caleb Thornton harbored a secret darker than the shadows that haunted his ranch, a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the price of a second chance. The silence that followed Caleb's proposal stretched like a held breath across the dusty square. Rosalie felt every eye upon her. The disappointed suitors, the curious townsfolk, Mrs. Abernathy's shocked expression. But all she could see was this stranger with winter in his eyes, offering her what no other man would. Her voice caught like a burr in her throat. She cleared it, lifted her chin with the dignity her mother had taught her. I would be honored, Mr. Thornton. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. Mayor Hutchins mopped his brow with a handkerchief, clearly relieved that the awkward situation had resolved itself. But Rosalie caught the meaningful looks exchanged between the townspeople, looks that spoke of secrets and whispered warnings. Caleb stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal hair that curled slightly at the collar. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his mouth seemed carved by sorrow. He was perhaps 35, old enough to have lived through heartbreak, but young enough to carry the weight of it like a stone in his chest. The preacher's waiting at the church, he said quietly, his voice rough as canyon wind. If you're willing. Today? The word nearly escaped her lips, but she swallowed it back. What choice did she have? Return east with Mrs. Abernathy, branded as damaged goods? Find work as a seamstress or laundress, eking out a lonely existence? At least marriage offered the possibility of a home, perhaps even children someday. I'm willing, she whispered. The walk to the whitewashed church felt like a dream painted in dust and desperate hope. Caleb offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength beneath his worn jacket. He smelled of leather and sage, of long days under an endless sky. Behind them, a small procession formed, Mayor Hutchins and his wife, Mrs. Abernathy clucking disapprovingly, a handful of curious onlookers. But notably absent were the other ranchers, the men who might have been expected to witness such an occasion. Their absence spoke volumes about whatever shadows surrounded Caleb Thornton. Reverend Morrison, a kindly man with gentle eyes and prematurely gray hair, waited at the altar. He'd clearly been expecting them, though his expression held a mixture of hope and concern that made Rosalie's stomach flutter with fresh nervousness. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice carrying the weight of countless ceremonies, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Caleb Thornton and Rosalie Whitmore in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over her like a strange dream. She'd imagined her wedding day countless times as a girl, the white dress, the flowers, the groom, who'd court her properly with sweet words and stolen kisses. Instead, she stood in her faded calico beside a man she'd known for all of 30 minutes, binding her fate to his with words that felt both sacred and surreal. Do you, Caleb, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? Caleb's voice was steady, final. I do. And do you, Rosalie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? She looked into those winter blue eyes, seeing pain there, but also something else, a desperate kind of hope, as if her yes might somehow ease the grief that carved lines around his mouth. I do. The ring he slipped onto her finger was simple gold, warm from his pocket. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Only later would she wonder whose ring it had been before. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Morrison's smile was gentle but troubled. You may kiss the bride. Caleb's kiss was brief, respectful, barely a brush of lips that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her chest. When he pulled back, something had changed in his eyes. Not love, not yet, but a kind of careful gratitude that made her heart ache. The ride to his ranch took them through countryside that stole her breath despite her nervousness. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, stands of aspen that whispered secrets in the wind, and in the distance, mountains that scraped the belly of the sky. It was beautiful and vast and utterly intimidating. It's about 5 miles to the house, Caleb said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving town. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with the easy grace of an animal perfectly in tune with its rider. Rosalie's borrowed mare seemed skittish by comparison, as if sensing her rider's uncertainty. It's beautiful country, she offered, desperate to break the silence that stretched between them like a chasm. It can be. His voice held a note of something. Bitterness? Regret? Can also be cruel as a snake's kiss when the mood takes it. They rode in silence after that. The only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats on packed earth. Rosalie found herself studying her new husband from the corner of her eye, trying to read the mysteries written in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands held the reins with unconscious expertise. What secrets lurked behind those winter eyes? What had happened to his first wife? And why had the townspeople looked at him with such a mixture of pity and unease? The questions multiplied like tumbleweeds in her mind, but she dared not voice them. Not yet. The ranch, when it finally came into view, was both more and less than she'd expected. The house was large, built of honey-colored logs with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But there was an air of neglect about it. Peeling paint on the shutters, a garden gone wild with weeds, curtains drawn tight against the afternoon. Sun.it looked like a place where happiness had once lived, but had long since packed its bags and moved on. Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton, Caleb said, dismounting with fluid grace. The name sounded strange on his lips, as if he were trying it out for sized-up Mrs. Thornton. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. She was married. To a stranger. In a place where the nearest neighbor was probably miles away and the secrets seemed to whisper from every shadow. But as Caleb helped her down from the mare, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary at her waist, Rosalie glimpsed something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. A flash of guilt so profound it made her wonder what terrible price she'd truly agreed to pay for a home of her own. The inside of the house told a story Rosalie wasn't sure she wanted to read. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light that managed to slip through the drawn curtains, and everywhere she looked, she saw the ghostly presence of another woman's touch that a sampler hung on the wall, Home Sweet Home, stitched in delicate blue thread. Dried flowers sat in a crystal vase on the mantel, their colors faded to the brown of old blood. And on the kitchen table, a china teacup sat precisely where someone had left it, as if waiting for its owner to return and finish her afternoon tea. I haven't. Caleb's voice broke the oppressive silence. He cleared his throat, tried again. I haven't changed much since Catherine passed. Catherine. So that was her name. Rosalie tried to picture the woman who'd lived here, who'd stitched that sampler and arranged those flowers. Beautiful, no doubt. Beloved, certainly. And dead, taking with her any hope Caleb might have had of loving again. She had lovely handwriting. Rosalie said softly, noticing the neat labels on the spice jars, the careful inventory lists pinned to the kitchen wall. Everything spoke of a woman who'd taken pride in her home, who'd built a life here with methodical care. Caleb's jaw tightened. She was perfect. The words came out rough, like they'd been scraped from his throat with a rusty blade. Everything a man could want in a wife. The unspoken comparison hung between them like smoke. Unlike you. The words weren't said, but Rosalie heard them anyway. She was the consolation prize, the second choice, the damaged goods that no one else had wanted. I'll show you to your room, Caleb said, already turning toward the stairs. Your room. Not our room. The distinction cut deeper than she'd expected. She followed him up the narrow staircase, noting the family photographs that lined the walls. Caleb and a petite brunette woman with laughing eyes and a smile that could light up a room. They looked blissfully happy, arms wrapped around each other with the easy intimacy of true love. This was the guest room, Caleb said, opening a door to reveal a small but clean space with a narrow bed and a washstand. I thought you might be more comfortable here. Until what? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He turned, and she saw something flicker in those winter blue eyes, something that might have been pain or might have been guilt. Until we know each other better. But even as he said it, Rosalie sensed there was more to it than that. The way he avoided her gaze, the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained between them, it all spoke of secrets buried deeper than good manners and proper courtship. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Rosalie finally found the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at her all day. How did she die? Caleb's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. For a long moment, he simply stared at his plate, and when he finally looked up, his eyes held a devastation so complete it made her chest tighten. Childbirth, he said quietly. She was carrying our first child. Something went wrong. He set down his fork with careful precision. The doctor from town, he said there was nothing he could do. We lost them both. The raw pain in his voice made her own throat close up. She'd known grief. The fire that had taken her family had left scars on her soul as well as her skin. But there was something in Caleb's expression that suggested his pain ran deeper than simple loss. I'm sorry, she whispered. It was my fault. The words came out flat, final. I should have gotten the doctor sooner. Should have known something was wrong. Should have. He pushed back from the table abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor like a scream. I failed her. Just like I'll probably fail you, Caleb. But he was already striding toward the door, his shoulders rigid with tension. I need to check on the horses, he said without looking back. Make yourself at home, such as it is. The door slammed behind him, leaving Rosalie alone with the ghosts and the growing certainty that she'd married a man haunted by more than simple grief. That night, she lay in the narrow guest bed listening to the sounds of the house settling. Around her, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft scratch of something moving in the walls. But louder than any of those sounds was the complete absence of footsteps in the room across the hall. Where was Caleb sleeping? She'd assumed he'd taken the master bedroom, but she'd heard no movement from that direction. No sound of boots on the floor, no rustle of bedclothes. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the darkness beyond the kitchen door. Around midnight, she finally drifted off to sleep, only to be awakened by the sound of voices. Low, urgent, drifting up from somewhere below. She crept to the window and peered down into the moonlit yard, expecting to see Caleb talking to one of the ranch hands. Instead, she saw him standing alone beside the barn, his head tilted back toward the star-scattered sky. His lips were moving, and even from this distance, she could see the anguish carved into every line of his body. He was talking to someone who wasn't there. Catherine. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her new husband was having conversations with his dead wife, standing in the cold night air pouring out his heart to a ghost. But as she watched, straining to catch his words, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. I'm sorry, Catherine. I know I promised I'd never, but I had to. You don't understand. If I don't have a wife, they'll start asking questions again. They'll want to know why I really left town that night. Why I came back covered in. His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. God help me, what have I done? Rosalie pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it would wake the dead. What had he done? What had happened that night Catherine died? And what did any of it have to do with his desperate need for a wife? As Caleb's anguished voice drifted up through the darkness, carrying words that spoke of guilt and secrets and terrible deeds, Rosalie began to understand that she hadn't just married a grieving widower. She'd bound herself to a man who might very well be a murderer. Sleep became a stranger to Rosalie that night. She lay rigid in the narrow bed, listening to every creak and whisper the old house made. jumping at shadows that danced across the walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Caleb's broken voice confessing to the darkness, saw the way his shoulders had shaken with guilt and grief. What have I done? The question echoed in her mind like a death knell. Had she married a man who'd killed his own wife? The thought made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to think rationally. If Caleb had murdered Catherine, why would he be so obviously tormented by it? Wouldn't a cold-blooded killer be better at hiding his guilt, unless the guilt was eating him alive from the inside? Dawn came gray and reluctant, creeping through the thin curtains like a thief afraid of being caught. Rosalie, dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a brown wool that had seen better days but was still respectable, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but she could smell coffee brewing and hear the distant sound of chopping wood. Through the window, she watched Caleb work, his axe rising and falling with mechanical precision. His shirt was already damp with sweat despite the cool morning air, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. He was attacking the woodpile like it had personally wronged him. She busied herself exploring the kitchen, trying to understand the woman who'd lived here before her. Catherine had been meticulous, every spice labeled, every pot and pan in perfect order. The pantry was well stocked despite months of neglect, and Rosalie found herself grudgingly admiring the other woman's foresight. She was planning for the future, Rosalie thought, running her fingers along the neat rows of preserved peaches and green beans, planning for the baby that would never come. You're up early. She spun around to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his hair dark with sweat, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked like a man who'd wrestled with demons all night and lost. I couldn't sleep, she said honestly. New place, I suppose. Something flickered in his expression, guilt, perhaps, or fear that she'd overheard his midnight confession. It takes time to adjust. Catherine said the same thing when she first. He stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching. I'm sorry. I shouldn't keep mentioning her. She was your wife, Rosalie said gently. Of course you think about her. But even as she said it, she found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the guilt she'd witnessed in the darkness. Did murderers feel remorse? Did they stand in their yards at midnight, pouring out their hearts to the ghosts of their victims? I'll be working near the north pasture today, Caleb said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. Fixing fence. There's a rifle above the mantel if you need it. And Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch might come by. She's been bringing food since Catherine passed. The way he said it, since Catherine passed, sounded rehearsed, like words he'd practiced until they felt natural. But Rosalie caught the slight hesitation, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. After he left, she found herself drawn to the master bedroom. The door had been closed yesterday, but now it stood slightly ajar, as if inviting her to explore. She pushed it open slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was a shrine to the dead. Catherine's clothes still hung in the wardrobe, her jewelry box set open on the dressing table, and the bed was made with the kind of precise care that suggested it hadn't been slept in for months. But it was the painting above the bed that made. Rosalie gasped that it was a portrait of Catherine, but not the laughing woman from the photographs downstairs. This Catherine was serene, almost ethereal, painted in soft pastels that made her look like an angel. Her hands were folded over her slightly rounded belly, and her eyes held a secret joy that spoke of new life and infinite possibilities. The baby, Rosalie realized. She was already showing when this was painted, but there was something else in the painting, something that made her skin crawl. Catherine's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved around the room, and there was an expression in them that wasn't quite joy, something sharper, more calculating. She was beautiful, wasn't she? Rosalie spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway, middle-aged, with graying hair and kind eyes that held a wealth of unspoken knowledge. This had to be Mrs. Patterson. I'm sorry, Rosalie stammered. I didn't mean to. No need to apologize, dear. I'm Martha Patterson. I live about 3 miles east. She stepped into the room, her gaze going immediately to the portrait. Catherine always did photograph well, though I must say, she looks different in this painting. More mysterious. There was something in Martha's tone that made Rosalie's pulse quicken. You knew her as well as anyone could know Catherine Thornton. Martha's smile was carefully neutral. She was a private person, kept her own counsel, if you know what I mean. But her eyes said more than her words. They spoke of secrets and suspicions of a woman who'd been more complex than her grieving husband wanted to admit. I brought you some bread, Martha continued, as if sensing Rosalie's growing unease. And some preserves. Figured you might need time to get settled before you start cooking. They walked back to the kitchen together, and Martha busied herself, unpacking a basket that smelled of cinnamon and home. But Rosalie could feel the older woman's eyes on her, assessing, calculating. Can I ask you something? Rosalie said finally. About Catherine. About what happened. Martha's hand stilled on the bread loaf. What do you want to know? Caleb said she died in childbirth. But Rosalie hesitated, then plunged ahead. But something about the way he talks about it doesn't feel right. Like he's hiding something. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folding and unfolding the cloth that had wrapped the bread. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Catherine didn't die in childbirth, honey. She died 3 days later, in her own bed, with no one but Caleb to witness it. Martha's eyes met hers, and Rosalie saw fear there, deep, abiding fear. The doctor said it was complications from the birth, but what? But Dr. Morrison was in Denver that week. The baby died during labor, and Catherine seemed to be recovering just fine. Then suddenly, she took a turn for the worse, started having convulsions, talking about things that made no sense. Martha's voice dropped even lower. She kept saying someone was trying to poison her. And the strangest part of all was that Caleb left town that same night, disappeared for nearly a week before coming back with a story about visiting his brother in Colorado Springs. But his brother died 2 years ago, and everyone in town knew it. The words hit Rosalie like a physical blow. Martha's revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and terrible possibility. Caleb had lied about his brother. Catherine had spoken of poison. And now Rosalie was alone in this house with a man who might have murdered his first wife. Why are you telling me this? Rosalie whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the kitchen table. Martha's eyes were filled with a grandmother's protective concern. Because you remind me of my own daughter, sweet, trusting, willing to see the best in people. She reached across the table and covered Rosalie's scarred hand with her own. And because Catherine came to see me the day before she died. She was frightened, honey. Said Caleb had been acting strange since they lost the baby, that he blamed her for not being strong enough to carry it to term. But that's grief, Rosalie said desperately, even as ice formed in her veins. People say terrible things when they're grieving. Maybe. Martha's voice held no conviction. But she also said he'd been giving her special teas, telling her they'd help her recover her strength. Said they tasted bitter, made her feel dizzy and sick to her stomach. Poison. The word echoed in Rosalie's mind like a death sentence. Had Caleb slowly poisoned his wife, driven by grief and blame over their lost child? And if so, what did that mean for her own future? There's something else, Martha continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. The night Catherine died, I saw lights moving around the old mine shaft up in the hills behind this property. Caleb's horse was gone from the stable, and when he came back 3 days later, he had scratches on his hands like he'd been digging. The room seemed to spin around Rosalie. She thought of the guilt in Caleb's voice the night before, his desperate confession to Catherine's ghost. They'll want to know why I really left town that night. Why I came back covered in what? Dirt? Blood? I have to go, Martha said suddenly, glancing toward the window where the sun was climbing higher. But listen to me, child, if you ever feel unsafe, if anything seems wrong, you come to my place. Day or night, you understand. After Martha left, Rosalie found herself alone with her fears and the oppressive silence of the house. Every shadow seemed to hide secrets. Every creak of the old wood sounded like footsteps. She tried to busy herself with cleaning, but her hands shook as she dusted Catherine's belongings, and she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. When Caleb returned for lunch, she could barely meet his eyes. He looked tired, his face grim with whatever thoughts had occupied him during the morning's work. But when he smiled at her, that sad, gentle smile that had first touched her heart, she felt her resolve waver. Could this man really be a killer? You've been busy, he said, noticing the way she'd organized the kitchen, the fresh bread cooling on the counter. Smells like home in here. Home. The word should have warmed her, but instead it sent chills down her spine. Would this place ever truly be home, or would it always be Catherine's house, filled with Catherine's ghost and the terrible secrets of her death? Martha Patterson came by, Rosalie said carefully, watching his reaction that Caleb's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Martha's a good woman, kind neighbor. She told me about Catherine. The words slipped out before she could stop them. About how she really died. This time, his reaction was unmistakable. His face went pale, and his hand clenched around the coffee cup she'd given him. For a moment, she thought he might deny it, might continue the lie about childbirth complications. Instead, he set down the cup and looked directly into her eyes. What exactly did Martha tell you? The quiet intensity in his voice made her heart race, but something in his expression, a desperate kind of honesty, gave her courage. That Catherine died 3 days after the baby. That she thought someone was poisoning her. That you left town and lied about where you went. Caleb was silent for so long, she began to fear she'd made a terrible mistake. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She's right. I did lie. He stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. God help me. I've been lying to everyone, including myself. Rosalie's blood turned to ice. Caleb, Catherine, was dying, he said, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. The baby's death, it broke something inside her. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, started talking about ending her own life, said she couldn't live with the guilt. He turned to face her, and she saw the truth written in every line of his face. Not the guilt of a murderer, but the desperate anguish of a man who'd watched helplessly as the woman he loved destroyed herself. She begged me to help her, he continued, his voice breaking. Said the pain was too much, that she couldn't bear another day. So I gave her what she wanted. The laudanum the doctor had left for her pain. I gave her enough to let her sleep forever. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither could cross. Mercy killing, not murder. A husband's final act of love for a wife consumed by grief. I buried her wedding ring and the baby's things up at the old mine, Caleb whispered. Couldn't bear to keep them, couldn't bear to throw them away. Then I told everyone she died from childbirth complications because I couldn't let people know what I'd done. Rosalie felt tears streaming down her cheeks. For Catherine, for Caleb, for the terrible burden he'd been carrying. Alone. And you married me because people were starting to ask questions. Because Martha wasn't the only one who noticed the inconsistencies in my story. He looked at her with those winter blue eyes, and she saw not a killer but a broken man desperate for redemption. I thought if I had a wife, a normal life, maybe I could forget. Maybe I could learn to live with what I'd done. She stood up slowly, her heart breaking for both of them. Here was a man who'd loved his wife enough to grant her final wish, who'd carried the secret like a stone in his chest for months. And here was she, a scarred woman nobody wanted, offering what comfort she could to someone even more damaged than herself. Caleb, she said softly, reaching out to touch his face. You gave her peace. That's not murder, that's love. For the first time since she'd known him, his winter eyes filled with tears. And as he pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world gone mad, Rosalie felt something bloom in her chest that she'd thought lost. Forever. Hope. The sun set over the Colorado Territory, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. And in the little house where grief had once held dominion, two broken people began the slow, careful work of healing each other's hearts. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, tenderly, growing like wildflowers in the spaces between scars. If this tale of second chances and hard-won redemption moved your heart, kindly show your appreciation with a like and share your thoughts below. And tell us, dear friends, from what corner of this great wide world are you watching today?